those of you who don't know, I'm Alexandra, and I'm doing the second part in an infinitely parted series. Actually, it's the second of two parts on Brunelleschi, and if you missed the first part, I'm hoping that this is a separately contained idea, but people can feel free to ask questions. But essentially, as people hopefully in this room have a sense of, we are very close to victory. And it's a real thing. It's not a guaranteed thing. People shouldn't think of it as that, but they should think of it as real, like as tangibly real as what we're experiencing now. And as a product of this real victorious, optimistic sense that Lyndon LaRouche has, he's put together a training program for some of the younger-ish members of our association, what he calls the basement team, to really develop in themselves and in the organization in general a higher sort of an upshift in terms of leadership capabilities. So I focused a little bit on the fight that broke out last week between mankind and the oligarchy, but I want to bring up something that's somewhat of a higher order, which is a real creative identity per se. And the most creative person I know, and probably everyone in this room knows, is Lyndon LaRouche. So even though this class is on Brunelleschi and how he built the biggest, but I don't necessarily mean grandest and biggest in terms of size, but dome ever built, which I think a lot of people are provoked and curious about. How did he do this amazing thing that had never been done before? So the way I wanted to initially approach this is to think about somebody who's like Lyndon LaRouche. And Lyndon LaRouche is not a practical person. I mean, anybody who would have done what he's been doing for the last 40 years is not a practical person. Because you just see things are getting worse and worse and worse, and you're like, oh, maybe it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. But he is committed to breaking the trends, and that's what makes him stand out and unique. But at some point, we want to get to a place where everybody is of that quality. You know, a certain culture, like for instance in Nicaragua, they're about to build, with the help of China, on the model of the American, you know, credit system of Hamilton, etc., they're about to build a canal through Nicaragua. And the thing that's so amazing about this is you think about what is the first thing they're doing. They're changing their whole educational system so that the young people of Nicaragua will actually know how to be engineers, heavy equipment operators, that essentially this project that you might be able to look at on a map and say, okay, there on the map, you know, they're going to dig a trench and ships are going to go through it. But this whole region of the world, the identity of young people is being changed, and they're being prepared to do something, you know, completely new. But what we're dealing with as a block is that that's the identity that everybody wants. You know, when Brunelleschi built the dome, there were hundreds and thousands of people who wanted to lay the brick to build it and help him make new discoveries. But in terms of actually sticking your neck out on the line and creating that capability, that's leadership, and that's what the people in this room represent. Because Lyndon LaRouche made the point a few months ago, most people will not muster within themselves the type of self-criticism that's necessary to create the future that they want. I don't know if that makes sense to people. And that's what we have to do, and it's challenging. So that's the type of person that Brunelleschi is. He brought people along with him. And this is the type of person that LaRouche is. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that you have to have quite a mind and quite an imagination. You know, not memorize everything on Wikipedia or something, but actually understand certain things about the universe, and that the universe is always changing. And one of the things that Mr. LaRouche brings up that's really important about what Brunelleschi did is that he destroyed the concept of straight lines. That for a couple of thousand years in the Dark Ages, people were committed to a very Euclidean, point, straight line, square, Aristotelian idea of the universe. All you can know is your senses, etc. And that might seem like something small, but it's something very big. And so Mr. LaRouche was first confronted with this idea. I don't know how many people heard the story about when he went to the Charlestown Naval Yard. Have people heard this story? When he was about 11 or 12 years old. And they were building a naval yard in Massachusetts where he grew up. And he was looking at the metal beams, and what did he notice about the steel beams? They had holes in them. And he brought this up to his geometry teacher in, 6th, 7th grade, that this is geometry, and she basically told him that he was crazy. But he discovered, from a very young age that there is a physical universe. There are principles that go against what you would expect, and that popular opinion of his time was actually against those truthful principles and looking to something easy. And even at 12 years old, one, he knew that would destroy society, and two, he sought out higher thinkers like Leibniz, and that led him on this whole other track. So that made me think about Filippo Brunelleschi, who I'm going to talk about, in this one little story, because he built this dome of the Santa Maria del Fiore, as you can see here. They started it in about 1420, and they finished about 1430, so it took about 10 years. They built it in 8 parts out of brick. There's a lot to go into on that we'll go into later. But he was a very, very respected person. How many people here have heard of Brunelleschi? How many people haven't? Okay. So I'll get into that a little bit tonight, because he's someone that Lyndon LaRouche identifies with Nicholas of Cusa and Kepler, of defining the basis for modern civilization, both in terms of science and also the fight against this oligarchical idea of man as an animal. So before I get to how he built the dome, can people see these windows here? Yes. When they hadn't decided yet how they were going to build this dome, the first thing they did is they built a drum to put the dome on. And they were going to build the thing without these windows here. And Brunelleschi, you think about LaRouche looking at the steel beams of the Charlestown Naval Yard with the holes in it. He said, oh, no, there has to be holes there. And everybody said, oh, well, windows are nice, but we don't know how we're going to build this dome, and if we put windows in this drum, and then we put this big dome on top, it's probably going to break. And he said, well, you need the holes in this dome. You actually need the holes. And so they went along with it, and then as they were building this drum to put the dome on that they weren't sure about how they were going to build, the drum started cracking. And he said, oh no, the cracks are supposed to be there too. And he was very, very assertive on this, and we'll get into this, but this is an example of how people want a certain future, but they don't know how to create it. Because the thing is, you know, everything in the universe is always changing, and we'll get into that. You know, buildings breathe, they move. And he had an understanding of this that nobody else did. And I guess I can go really quickly into this, that in the 1300s, coming out of the Dark Ages, the city of Florence wanted to build a cathedral, a new cathedral for the city. And they didn't want it to be the architecture of France, which had invaded southern Italy, which are these very thick walls. They didn't want the Gothic architecture of, you know, the empires of the north. They wanted an architectural structure that was actually new. And they weren't sure how they were going to build it, but they really wanted it because for political reasons. And the church was the very first church that was not built or not funded by a king or a queen or the church, but it was actually funded by the city. And so they had, it was sort of like the Apollo mission. They had this, we're going to do something we've never done before, and we're going to get out of the Dark Ages. And the people that were responsible for this were people like the great-great-grandfather of Machiavelli, who many people probably know. Some of the grandparents of Brunelleschi, Alberti, a lot of the Renaissance thinkers that you know, their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents were involved in this great mission. And so they decided that as a part of it, they were going to build this dome, and they had certain proportions based on the Bible, but when you look at this, the proportions, this had never actually been done before. And the idea was it was going to be freestanding, it was going to be beautiful. They weren't going to hold it together with, like, you know, lumber. They weren't going to put ugly you know, buttresses around it, etc. So this is a challenge that Brunelleschi grew up around. And before I get into that and how he solved it, the real issue of how he solved it, because Lyndon LaRouche said Brunelleschi discovered the principle of the minimum, Cousin discovered the principle of the maximum, and that was the basis for Kepler discovering universal gravitation. So before I get to the dome per se, what is the characteristic of the universe in which a dome or a church or a cathedral would be built? And because I was, you know, LaRouche is really, he's put forth a challenge in recent times of actually looking at life and cognitive life in the solar system and the solar system in the galaxy. And what types of interactions are you looking at? And so I was thinking about this. I found this wild thing. This is, now, it's not really, you can't really think about this in terms of straight lines and pathways because there's a harmony to the solar system. But I thought even this is kind of funny because here you have this idea of the way that the planets move. But can you see that the planets are moving in a galaxy that's moving?
Yeah, that's how they really do. Wow. Is that on YouTube?
Yeah. Here, I'll play it one more time for people.
Yeah, there's other animations of that. But that's a good one.
So if the universe takes this type of behavior in the large, why would it stop? Why wouldn't it be that way in the small as well, right? In a building or, you know, in nature. So we can start off two things. One is this here by Mr. LaRouche, which will give you a sense of what we're looking at here in terms of universal. Oh. Real quick, here's one more thing. This is a painting they built in the 1360s before painted before the dome was even built. And if you can see, it's not even as beautiful as what was done in real life, because it's being held together by these little buttressy thingies right here. You see that?
Yeah.
And then if you go back, so even an artist in their imagination couldn't even imagine what Brunelleschi could physically do in the real world. So, actually, this is what I'll do. People can save this, the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche, and read it to themselves. And we'll look at this thing here. The one that says Didacta Ignorantia, Part 2. And just to give people a sense, we're going to be looking at what Brunelleschi discovered in the small, in this idea there are no straight lines. And that's, the universe is a funny thing, but he was working simultaneously with Nicholas of Cusa, who was a cardinal, and developed a profound scientific method for modern civilization. How do you come to know what is true in a universe that is always changing? Because just because the universe is always changing doesn't mean there isn't truth, right? So, and he was looking at the maximum, which we talked more about last week, which is God. But I wanted to give people a sense of his method so that you can start to think about what Brunelleschi's method was. This man, Nicholas of Cusa, actually was a part of something called the Council of Florence, which was held under this great cathedral in the 1430s, which temporarily unified the Eastern and Western churches around the idea of the filioque, that Christ represents man in the image of God. So we're not going to read this whole thing, just through or up to paragraph 95. Is there anybody who is burning to read? Like Carol?
I can read.
Okay.
I'm not burning to read. Corollaries preliminary to inferring one infinite universe. It will be very advantageous to set forth from out of our beginning the preliminary corollaries of our instruction in ignorance, for they will furnish a certain facility regarding an endless number of similar points which in like manner can be inferred, and they will make clear the points to be discussed. I maintain at the outset of my remarks that with regard to things which are comparatively greater and lesser, we do not come to a maximum in being an impossibility. Hence, in my earlier remarks, I indicated that precise equality befits only God. Wherefore, it follows that, except for God, all possible things differ. Therefore, one motion cannot be equal to another, nor can one motion be the measure of another, since necessarily the measure and the thing measured differ. All these points will be of use to you regarding an infinite number of things. Nevertheless, if you transfer them to astronomy, you will recognize that the art of calculating lacks precision, since it presupposes that the motion of all other planets can be measured by reference to the motion of the sun. Even the ordering of the heavens with respect to whatever kind of place, or with respect to the risings and settings of the constellations, or to the elevation of a pole into things having to do with these, is not precisely knowable. And since no two places agree precisely in time and setting, it is evident that judgments about the stars are, in their specificity, far from precise. If you subsequently adapt this rule to mathematics, you will see that equality is actually impossible with regard to geometrical figures, and that no thing can precisely agree with another, either in shape or in size. And although there are true rules for describing the equal of a given figure as it exists in its definition, nonetheless, equality between different things is actually impossible. Wherefore, ascend to the recognition that truth, free from material conditions, sees, as in a definition, the equality which we cannot at all experience in things. Since in things, equality is present only defectively. Press onward. Conformably to the rule, there is no precision in music. Therefore, it is not the case that one thing perfectly harmonizes with another in weight or length or thickness. Nor is it possible to find between the different sounds of flutes, bells, human voices, and other instruments comparative relations which are precisely harmonic, so precisely that a more precise one could not be exhibited. Nor is there in different instruments of the same kind, just as also not in different men, the same degree of true comparative relations. Rather, in all things difference according to place, time, complexity, and other considerations is necessary. And so, precise comparative relation is seen only formally, and we cannot experience imperceptible objects in most agreeable, undefected harmony because it is not present there. Ascend now to the recognition that the maximum, most precise harmony is an equality of comparative relation which a living and bodily man cannot hear. For since this harmony is every proportion ratio, it would attract to itself our soul's reason ratio, just as infinite light attracts all light. So that the soul, freed from perceptible objects, will not without rapture hear with the intellect's ear the supremely concordant harmony. A certain immensely pleasant contemplation could here be engaged in, not only regarding the immortality of our intellectual, rational spirit, which harbors in its nature incorruptible reason, to which the mind attains of itself to the concordant and the discordant likeness in musical things, but also regarding the eternal joy into which the blessed are conducted, once they are free from the things of this world. And I will deal with this topic elsewhere. Furthermore, if we apply our rule to arithmetic, we see that no two things can agree in number. And since, with respect to a difference of number, there is also a difference of composition, complexity, comparative relation, harmony, motion, and so ad infinitum, we hereby recognize that we are ignorant. No one human being is as another in any respect, neither in sensibility, nor imagination, nor intellect, nor in activity, whether writing or painting or in art. Even for 1,000 years, one individual strove to imitate another in any given respect. He would never attain precision, though perceptible difference sometimes remains unperceived. Even art imitates nature as best it can, but it can never arrive at reproducing it precisely. Therefore, medicine as well as alchemy, magic, and other transmutational arts lacks true precision, although one art is truer in comparison with another, i.e. medicine is truer than the transmutational arts, as is self-evident. Is that it? Oh, okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay, good.
So hopefully people have some thoughts about this. It's quite a lot. But throughout all these different metaphors, you know, he says one motion cannot be equal to another motion, nor can one motion measure of another, since necessarily the measure and the thing being measured is different. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on this so far, or questions or concerns or text messages they need to respond to. But essentially, this is what I want people to think through, is everything in the universe is changing and in motion, and there's this delightful quote from Lyndon LaRouche that you don't have quantity, you don't have things. What you have is a certain quality. And we can get into some of that a little bit, but sort of stepping back from that idea, I want to go back to the beginning of Brunelleschi's life before he made this incredible discovery, and what really provoked him around this idea of how he could build the dome. And, you know, I brought this up last week, but when Brunelleschi was young, he spent 20 years, well, first of all, he was a goldsmith, and he spent 20 years in Rome, which was in ruins, with Donatello. You know, in the height of the Roman Empire, there was 2 million people, and during the time of Brunelleschi, there were 20,000 that lived in Rome. And what he was absolutely committed to do, and mind you, the fact that he grew up 3 blocks from a church that had this great ambition but no idea how to do it, played a huge part. Oh, this thing is on, sorry. So one of the things that he did over these 20 years is he spent a lot of time looking at the Pantheon. Have people seen this before?
Yeah.
It's one of the biggest domes ever built, and it's big. It's made of concrete. In fact, to this day, different layers of concrete, different thicknesses. To this day, they have no idea how the Romans mixed the cement for this. They still don't know. But as you can see, you don't see very much of the dome because it's being held in by 20-foot walls. So on the inside, it's, you know, nice, you see a dome. On the outside, you sort of just barely see it poking up. So he spent 20 years. He even climbed up to the top of this thing and removed part of the top to actually study it. And as I told some people last week, he knew he was dealing with an oligarchy that wanted to keep human knowledge away from mankind, so he lied and told everyone he was looking for gold. But in addition to looking at the dome, he spent a lot of time measuring and excavating these Greek and Roman columns. And just like a musical scale or a Kepler solar system, if people looked into it, the Greeks discovered there were certain harmonic proportions in architecture. And they were very similar proportions used to those in music. And if you look at the different names like Ionic, Corinthian, etc., these are also the names for different musical styles from that time. Now, the other thing that he discovered is, I don't know if most people can tell, see how the top part of these pillars is smaller than the bottom part? People see that? And it's true for all of them. And what you find is that if you don't do that, if you look at something like the Parthenon as opposed to the Pantheon, and you can get videos and pictures, every single brick or stone in the Parthenon is different in Greece. And that in order to get the appearance of these beautiful straight line columns that you see in architecture, everything actually has to be curved. Because the human eye, the human observer, can only see straight if you're tricked to see straight. And so it's not even just a question of gravity, that this is also done from the standpoint of beauty, from sense perception. It also makes them lighter, so you don't have as much heavy weight at the top. But there's also an aesthetic reason for that. So these are the kinds of things that that he was discovering. Now, when you're a goldsmith, one of the things that you do is you play around with different metals, right? And if you're a scientifically minded goldsmith like Brunelleschi, you start noticing things way different. They're heavier, they're lighter, they dissolve differently, they melt at different temperatures. So you really are confronted with this idea of proportion and change and these types of things. And in fact, I printed it out for people, but you don't have to read it, but this is a section on layman on weights and measures by Nicholas of Cusa, the same scientist who basically recorded some of the work and ideas that Brunelleschi had in this dialogue, which is really fun. Now, another thing that Brunelleschi also created were these cranes and lifts. And when you make cranes and lifts, you also notice certain things. Like it's a different motion to move. Like, I don't know how many people here have worked on a construction site, but when you're moving something, right, it's different. It's a different motion to move it side to side than to move it up and down. Have people noticed that? Now, this is really cool. Anybody here who rides a bike or drives a car probably really appreciates the reversible gears and the gears on their automobile or car or bike or whatever. And these were actually invented by Brunelleschi while he was building the dome. It's these two oxen, they go around in circles. And as they go around, this little thing turns, and then this little thing turns this gear. And then, instead of unharnessing up to lower the thing, you move this gear down, and then this gear turns the bigger gear. Does that make sense to people? Mm-hmm. So, he really got a sense of how these things were changing. And this is a crane that he invented. He had all these different, here's another crane. And cranes are also very challenging because when you're moving something, you have to create a weight or something equivalent of that weight to move the thing around, right, to keep it steady. So he invented a lot of this stuff. Do people know how before Brunelleschi invented this thing in like 1420, do people know when they built cathedrals and stuff how they got the heavy stone up? They had human beings walk in a wheel, and that's pretty insane. So you could tell he hated the oligarchy and didn't think human beings were animals because he invented a contraption for animals to do what animals should do and not human beings. So anyways, these are different things that he was playing around with as he was investigating how to build this dome. Now, when Mr. LaRouche challenged us to look into how did he actually do this? How did he do something that was never done before? How did he, destroy straight lines or whatever? He started singing this song. Have you guys heard the Funicula song? I don't know if anyone wants to sing it, but if you have Italian grandparents, what he said is one of the things that you have to look at is these funicular bridges. And I don't know if anyone here has ever run across a rope bridge. I have. It's really fun. And what you notice is, like, as you're running, the bridge starts pushing you forward because it wants to keep its shape and it doesn't want you to ruin it. So it just sort of pushes you along. Have people ever run across those things? Wow, it's a tough crowd. I don't know if people need coffee or maybe I'm just like really boring. Anyway, so we brought up this idea of looking at the rope bridge. So I thought, okay, if he said look at a rope bridge, let's look at a rope bridge. So I thought, okay, what's the closest thing you can get to a rope bridge in this room? A chain. So, to look at some principles of this rope bridge, I have this chain here, and I need some volunteers. You want to volunteer?
Yeah, what do you want us to do?
Stand up.
Walk across this bridge.
Okay. Yeah. Now, what I want you to do is, I want you to hold this, and I want you to open your arms and tell me if it feels like it's getting heavy, lighter, or if it feels the same. How many people think it'll feel the same?
I do.
You do?
Same amount of metal you're holding, but it's probably not true.
Don't worry, I'm not going to use this for any purposes other than...
My
Okay.
first hypothesis would be that it would get heavier. But mind you, if you go all the way, then it's obviously
I'll go for lighter.
So there's gravity, then there's tension, as far as I remember physics, and then there's mass and something else.
My hands have to be straight, right?
Yeah, and now open it up.
Don't mind mass.
How are they going?
Try to make sure that your arms are as straight as possible.
Okay.
It's okay, there's no right answer, so just another people's
Well,
different.
The weight is still the same, obviously. Now, it all depends. We're talking about muscles here. I mean, when you ask me, it gets heavier or not, it just depends, on my muscle system.
Well, are you doing
is it,
the same amount of work?
even as far as lifting this up?
Yeah.
I would say yes. I mean, sure, I'm doing the same. But, if it feels heavier or lighter, in any position, I guess it's because it has to do with my muscle system here, how it can handle the vertical force.
Yeah, but if it's the same amount of...
Tension.
All right, who else wants to try?
I'll try.
There's no right or wrong answer. Yes.
Sorry, I mean, if I...
No, that's fine. You did a great job.
You want to try or? You can go ahead.
This is a new exercise routine.
She's going to market the video.
Hey, this is Southern California. Somebody will buy this chain for $100. You too can have the Obama arms. Okay.
It feels
Keep your arms straight.
Yeah, you want to keep your arms straight.
straight. The weight feels the same, but the tension feels different. With the arms out in front, the tension is different than when the arms are out to the side.
Well, according to one theory, when you have this in this position, now the center of gravity of this is over here, about let's say a meter away from the center of his body. But in this position, the center of the gravity is almost
There
there.
it is.
So the further the center of gravity gets, the harder it, it's supposed to get. I mean, the heavier it's supposed to feel.
It's like she mentioned with construction and the cranes. If your crane is like this and your weight is here, you can maybe lift so much, but when your weight is way out here, you got to lift less because the leverage is more.
That's right.
People actually pull their cranes over like that, and they don't know.
All right, you're next. Except you're gonna have to have your eyes closed. For this.
4 of them?
All 4 of them?
Now you only
See, I don't have my glasses on, so I didn't get your joke. Okay, I couldn't see you. Now, you don't have to close them yet. I want you to hold this, just this one
His
side.
arms are too long, that chain's too short.
Well, actually, here, try it out without closing your eyes. Just play around with it. What's your name?
Constantine.
Okay, nice to meet you. I'm Alexandra.
So I just put it aside, right?
Yeah, and then just open up your arms.
I actually feel that it makes it lighter a little bit.
The Russians think alike.
Yeah, like somewhere over here, it becomes kind of lighter. That's heavy. And then I think the further I put it together, it wants to kind of collapse together, so it becomes heavier again, or something like that. Well, I mean, I have 4 eyes and I'm from Russia, so.
Wait, you're not done.
Oh.
There. Okay, now close. Okay, hold this.
Okay.
Hold the top chain, or you can hold just some of the top chain. Okay, I'm a little shorter than you. Let's be at the same height. Okay, now I want you to close your eyes.
You're not gonna push me.
I'm not going to do anything evil. Okay? Are your eyes closed?
Yeah.
Now, does it feel heavier or lighter? Don't open it. Or the same?
That feels a little lighter, but can we like?
Okay, we're going to keep going. Just keep your eyes closed. Does it feel heavier or lighter or the same?
Kind of the same.
Okay, keep your eyes closed. Does it feel heavier, lighter, or the same?
I would say more kind of. I'm confused right now. I think it's more of the same.
Okay, open your eyes.
I,
I took a bunch of the chain away. Why does it feel the same?
can we repeat the experiment?
Plus, Alexandra.
You know the solution though.
It's just I think the change is very subtle, so I'm trying to spot the change, but it's kind of hard sometimes as it happens kind of quickly maybe, and my kind of feelings or muscles adjust to it.
Yeah.
Again?
Okay.
Okay.
Hey, Alexander?
The same.
Okay.
Would you just move over so I can get it on the...
We're recording. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Don't worry, I don't work for the NSA anymore. Okay.
I work for KGB.
I still work for them. Okay, so are your eyes closed?
Yes.
Actually, you don't have to close them anymore because now you know what I'm doing.
Okay.
But, or you can. Okay. Does it feel heavier or lighter or the same?
Right now?
Yeah.
Say the truth. The same. The same.
Heavier?
That kind of feels a little heavy. I don't know if I'm starting to get tired. I'm sorry if I'm saying something that's
You don't have to.
not according to the physics laws of the universe.
No, you did an excellent job. Let's give them a round of applause. Does anyone else want to try this final?
Could you change the experiment and do it the other way? Instead of the 2 chains here, you start down at the bottom and then go up?
What do you mean, like this?
No. Somebody else should probably do the experiment, but...
Oh, you mean like start from here?
Yeah, start from down
Sure.
there.
Yeah, I can do that. Okay.
change anything?
I don't know, what do you think?
It feels the same.
Ha ha, I changed it.
Maybe somebody else can get that.
There
Well,
probably has to
theoretically,
be a
it shouldn't
bigger
change.
weight.
Theoretically, it shouldn't change because you're taking half of the weight and he's taking the other half. And I know you changed the situation, but then every time he's still holding and responsible for lifting just a half of it, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I mean, not whatever it is, but I don't know. His half remains the same.
Well, here's the funny thing, right? Is why is it when there's the same amount of chain, you feel a difference, and when there's a less of chain or more of chain going this way, you feel no difference? I mean, how is it that when he's holding this thing, I can keep taking things away and it still feels the same?
I might have an answer to that, Alexandra. I think that, as far as I know, the tension created along the chain kind of fights against the gravity. So it creates a different kind of force that reduces maybe the gravity, which reduces not the mass but the weight. And maybe the same thing over here. Well, I can say like a creepy thing. When I was in med school in Russia, what they told me is the dead body feels much heavier than carrying a live one.
Yeah.
Because the tension of the muscles, when the person is alive, create that kind of a force that kind of reduces the gravity. So then, if the body is kind of
Dead weight.
That's it. That's interesting. That's true.
something
When you're unconscious.
Well, there is something very special, and we'll get into it, into the shape of the hanging chain. It's interesting, why does it take the shape it does and not just become a perfect half circle or something? And you see these, and we'll get into this a little bit more, this hanging bridge shape. You also see it in nature. Like if I were to take this, let's see if I can even do this. Well, I'm too short, but if I were to hang this chain in the reflection of this arch here, you would actually see the same shape. So there's something very special about this shape. And you think someone who's a goldsmith, this is stuff that they're playing around with if they're scientific. Now, let's see here. I guess we'll go to another experiment. Now, the thing about a dome, right, is it's not two-dimensional. Like this shape and the bridges, they're two-dimensional, right? But a dome isn't. So now, we're going to play with bubbles. Now, most people here know the shape a bubble takes, right? But it's very hard being a bubble. There's a lot of tension involved. So when you have a circle in Euclidean geometry, right? When you have a circle, the three-dimensional version of the circle is a sphere, right? So, what if I took two circles and whoever uses these whiteboard markers next, I'm sorry there's bubbles all over them. What if instead of making one bubble, I use 2 circles and pull them apart to make a new bubble, what shape do people think that would take?
I've seen that experiment before, so I'm going to be quiet.
So 1 circle makes a sphere. It's not a perfect sphere, obviously. I'm not going to shatter everything I've said for the last 40 minutes. But it makes a spherical thing. These are really bad bubbles.
Maybe a little more soap.
So what if you, yeah, they do. What if you had 2 circles and you pulled them apart to make a bubble? What shape do people think that would be?
Oval, maybe, like, no,
Like this?
kind of like
Like a
like a
cylinder?
honeydew or something, maybe?
A honeydew?
Yeah.
Oh, you mean like a shape more like this?
Kind of.
But I'm going to take the 2 circles and pull them apart to make a shape.
A cylinder.
It's going to curve inward.
Or
So it's going to be a cylinder. But what about gravity? Maybe it'll go like this.
like a bridge.
Yeah, maybe it'll sag like an old lady. Well, gravity, you know.
It works on you over the years, that's it.
I'll be there one day if you're lucky. What do people think? Do they think it'll be like this? This is the perfect Euclidean universe. This is the saggy universe. So those are some choices. Do people have any other hypotheses? Who don't already know the answer?
Well, if the wind blows in some direction, it probably might bend the bubble
It'll be curved
forward.
inward on both sides.
Have you done this before?
Are they gonna combine each other, and try to become one? Or-
Well, let's find out. Now, people might have to come a little close because can you see that?
Oh,
No,
You face it towards us.
it goes inwards.
Everybody's going to have to come up and
It's really hard to turn this sideways. I'll try though.
I thought you were still gonna
Stand
blow.
back of the table.
no, you're just going to separate those.
Well, I could blow, but if I blow, it'll
Yeah,
break because
it
these
goes
bubbles are
inwards.
so bad.
Oh.
It looks like a circle from this angle.
Whoa.
So instead of blowing, I'm pulling them apart because they're really fragile.
There, that's a good one there. That's what
Yeah, that's good.
People see that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
What do
please.
they notice about the bottom and the top?
Are they narrowing or are they?
They have a curve.
They have a curve inward.
Is it like the inside of a toroid?
they're going in.
Oh.
I think it's the tension of the, I don't know what that would do in outer space with no gravity, but
They tend to separate and then
On the bottom and the
yeah,
top.
this is,
Oh, that's a good one.
yeah.
and when there's a film on the inside,
Uh-huh.
they're actually more straight like when you get a perfect contact and there's a big hole through the middle, then they kind of form I think they form the catenary on all the way around.
If I can blow, actually, if somebody pokes a pencil through it, I might be able to stretch it out more, but I think you get the general idea.
So they say it turns into a catenary? Is that the shape you say?
Yeah, I think when it gets a good contact between the two and there's not a film in the middle, then it's a catenary shape all the way around. It's equal. It's tension somewhere.
Yeah, so there's something about this shape it does make the hanging chain. And just like the reflection, just like this bridge or the chain, it makes the same shape both at the bottom and at the top, which is the shape of this hanging chain. So it's basically like you take a hanging chain and you rotate it around. And the question is, why does it do that? Why doesn't it take this shape? Why does it take this shape? Do people have any ideas about that?
Well, it's trying to pull the material down, and if the material allows it, the gravity will pull it down, and obviously the center would be the lowest. And as you keep bringing those two surfaces closer, obviously that curve is going to be more.
But why does the bottom one curve up?
Yeah, why does this one curve up?
That's against gravity.
Maybe because they both tend towards the center of the circle.
I just think it's tension between the contacts.
Well, it's interesting because, with the chain, you want to stop and think, well, it's the gravity. But then there's also, when you start looking at this, and gravity plays a role, but it's finding the most stable shape that it can take. Which actually, in a certain sense, if you think about it, this is actually less tension for the bubbles to go in like this than for them to try to go straight, right? Because they would be pulling themselves apart. Does that make sense? Like the bubbles know how to organize themselves so that there's the least amount of tension. And it would be really great if we knew how to organize ourselves so that we would have the least amount of tension. But we're all working on that. So it's a really interesting idea, because what you're looking at is there's the principle of gravity, and then there's this other principle sort of intersecting with it. Actually, my friend Natalie was telling me they want to start using these catenoids to build lunar bases. Which that's what really provoked me, because I was like, wait, there's no gravity on the moon. But this principle, this least action, least tension principle still applies. So this again harkens back to the holes in the drum, the Charlestown Naval Yard. Euclidean geometry is just crap. And so someone like Brunelleschi, these are the things that he's dealing with. He's dealing with this idea of change and harnessing this power of change.
When you say there's no gravity, there is some microgravity in the molecules of.
Oh yeah, there's gravity. What I mean to say is it's not as dominant a force as it is here on the moon. Because it is a funny question, if you hung this chain on the moon, would it take the same shape? And it would.
On the moon?
There is gravity on the moon.
Yeah.
It's just not as strong as on Earth.
There's probably no place where there's absolutely no gravity at all, right? Anyways, I'll leave that discussion for another time. So, I started thinking about, Brunelleschi's building a dome. He would probably be tapping into these types of principles, like the chain, how it has an ability, no matter where you are on the chain, this experiment we did, it organizes itself. And how many things can you change them or poke them, and they don't maintain their sovereignty, their structure, their strength. So there's something very special that this catenary is constantly changing, right? Otherwise, when you hung it, it would be like a perfect half circle. But yet there's something about it that is uniform, that you can count on. And this actually ultimately gets to certain discoveries that are made by Leibniz on this question of the calculus. So as an architect, you know, these are the types of things that he was looking at. And so I'll just go through a couple quick things, and I won't bore people. You're an architect, right? Are you the one who's an architect? Yeah. Okay. So if you have any commentary on this particular point, you can say. Do we have a oh. So, one of my favorite, so what's a dome? Well, in a certain sense, some people think of a dome as rotating an arch, right? So, here you have an arch, an invisible arch. And if you rotate it around, you get a dome. And you can sort of think about it that way. I wouldn't necessarily think about it that way from the standpoint of what Brunelleschi was thinking, but from the standpoint of explaining a couple things, I'll use this as a metaphor. So, in the beginning, there was the simple building. And there's a limit, you know, building like this. I mean, how far do you think far out we could expand these walls and keep building the ceiling before eventually the ceiling would come caving in on us? It's not like, it can't infinitely extend, right? If I kept moving this wall out, eventually someone would be like, hey guys, I think we should get out of here. So that was a sort of limiting factor in architecture. So then what they started doing is they started building these arches, because then the pressure is more evenly distributed and it's not just in the middle. Like we're here, there's more pressure in the middle. And so you could go even wider. And they do other things too, like, you know, buttresses inside, you know, these types of things. Then somebody got really just over the top and wild and started building these things called pointed arches, where you take your circle and if you want to make it even taller, you take 4/5 of the circle or a certain chunk of the diameter and you rotate it up like this. And this was the type of curvature that was required for Brunelleschi's dome in the instructions. I'm actually not convinced that it's a pointed fifth, but I will save that for later. Now, why is it that you do these things? Well, because in architecture and in life, you deal with the fact that, you know, material is always moving. It's either going through tension or compression, and oftentimes it's going through both at the same time. So a tendency to want to expand, and then a tendency to want to contract, to come together. The bubbles have a lot of tension, right? They're very fragile. And Da Vinci actually talks about the arch, where he says that an arch consists of two weaknesses leaning on each other becomes strengths. And to build most arches, as you see here, you have something called an armature, which is you build the arch, but as you're building it, it's very weak. So you hold it together until you put your cornerstone in to bring those two weaknesses together into strengths. But with a dome that big, very, very big, that wasn't such a reality. So, you know, I started thinking about, well, what kind of principle would you use to, could you actually find an arch that within itself, or a building process that within itself found that uniformity of tension and compression before it was actually completed? And that's what you get with the catenary. And because it always knows what it is, even before it is. And just to show you, this is a Catalan vault. This is not a dome, but when you're actually...
1 billion eyes watching, the mother of all cups.
So you can see that you have a certain ability to use this power of compression, that the bricks he's putting in there are actually, you know what? What time is it right now?
9:20.
Okay. I'm going to show you something even cooler than this. Let's see. Uh-oh, he doesn't use Google. Uh-oh. Just to give you a sense of how you can do this, one of the first domes that Brunelleschi ever built, because this wasn't the first thing he ever did, he took instead of thinking of building an arch this way, he built it this way. He laid the brick this way. And he had a little wooden contraption that he used to build this dome as he was going. And it was probably like 1/12 or 1/10 of the size. But this ability to compress the work that you've done in such a way that you can continue to build and have a self-sustaining structure, you see this actually in igloos. And I get really depressed watching igloo building because I think it's really messed up that we had the technology to record such a thing and people were still doing it. So I find it a little upsetting. But I think it's useful to see this, so I'll show you.
Cut from the hard-packed drifts. An igloo provides the Eskimo with shelter during the long winter months. Easy to build once you know how, his home is compact and strong. The igloo gains strength from its ingenious design. After the first row of blocks has been put in place, one block is cut to form a sloping surface. The second row is started on this slope, and the blocks built up in a continuous spiral, the key to the whole structure. On the way west shore of Hudson's Bay, the low rolling terrain offers little protection against the bitter cold of the northwest wind. Chupak and Akiutok, having left their families in the igloos of the winter camp, are coming into the post to trade. They look forward to a mug-up of tea and pilot biscuits at the trader's house. The two Eskimos admire the wooden buildings of the white man, but for their own dwelling, they will build an igloo. First, Akiutok, the elder of the two, selects a suitable site. With his probe, he tests the snow. It must be hard-packed, and yet not so hard that it will not cut. It must not be layered with streaks of soft snow that would cause it to break in handling. And there must be sufficient good snow in one place to provide all the building material for his igloo. This isn't always as easy as it seems, but the average snowfall of the Arctic is less than in the temperate regions of Canada. Like all good architects, they use the material found around them. The snow will be both bricks and mortar. Packed hard by the constant wind, it can be cut by a snow knife or ordinary handsaw into blocks of any size or shape. The first blocks are cut from a rectangular trench, which often serves as the entrance tunnel to the completed igloo. A row of heel marks is sometimes used as a baseline for the first row of blocks. The igloo must be nearly circular, otherwise, when the construction nears the top, the wall will collapse. From a lifetime of living with it, the Eskimo knows his snow. Providing it is of good quality, he can build the igloo entirely from snow found within the circle of the walls. And since the blocks are taken from inside the circle, the actual floor of the igloo will be the depth of one block below the surface of the snow outside. After the first row has been erected, the cut to form the sloping surface is made. The next row starts on this slope, and the upward spiral begins. When building an igloo for an overnight shelter, the Eskimo works quickly. But for a more permanent dwelling, he takes his time, fitting each block carefully to the previous one and to the one below. A single Eskimo can build an overnight igloo in 40 minutes, or he can spend 2 days constructing a large, comfortable dwelling for himself and his family. The Eskimo is a nomad. His need is for a temporary home, for who knows how long he will stay. His home gets dirty, he moves out and builds a new one. If hunting is bad, he goes off in search of food, building his new house where game is plentiful. The Eskimo builds his home around him, always working from the inside. He has cut the first row of blocks so as to have a slight inward lead, which will gradually become more acute as the walls grow higher. Being right-handed, Chupak works in an anti-clockwise direction. Left-handed Eskimos, this rounded shape is another excellent example of good use of the fundamental laws of architecture. Engineers and architects have found no better way of building an igloo. It has no corners and no waste space.
There's also an advantage to building a spiral as opposed to laying them in rows.
Although the temperature is 40 below, the exertion of building causes both Eskimos to perspire freely within the snow walls of their almost completed igloo. Setting the last few blocks in place is a ticklish job. Unless well fitted, they could easily fall in. The Eskimo's only construction tool is his snow knife. He uses it for cutting the blocks, shaping them, and fitting them together. Originally, it was made of bone or ivory, but now he buys a steel one from the trader for about the value of a fox skin. Still using snow from inside the igloo, the last block is shoved out through the narrow opening and trimmed to fit. Not until this key block is inserted and fitted, like the keystone of an arch, will the igloo take its final strength. After it has been completed, the warmth of the inside, combined with the wind on the outside, will cement the blocks firmly together. The igloo will be strong enough to support a man's weight, although a sharp blow of the fist might punch a hole in the snow wall. Like the man who paints, whose sleeping robes and extra skins to cover the sleeping platform provide perfect insulation.
So, turn the lights on. So that's what you're dealing with is, you know, if this dome were a perfect circle with the size that was being demanded by previous generations, it would have just collapsed. So Brunelleschi had to, you know, to think creatively and actually think about a finished product. And it's interesting because you think about this igloo, right? Why is it they built the spiral? Why didn't they just lay blocks in a row and then another set of blocks and another set of blocks and another set of blocks? That there's certain, when you figure out, when you think about this idea of tension and compression and motion within materials, the idea is not to find a perfect balance, but to actually have a harmony. And one of the things that this catenary has is it has universal horizontal tension. So in this direction, the tension is actually uniform. And there's a lot that can be said on how he used the catenary, which I have a few ideas about. I think these arches, or these granite arcs, I think these are catenaries. But you also look at the brickwork here, and it's a very similar idea, you know. And this is something he found in the Parthenon and other things he looked at in Greece. So when building this dome, this is what he was really thinking through, I think, is this principle of the catenary. Looking at gravity, but also, and you know, what he was probably thinking is, what shape does this dome want to take? And a shape that, just like the soap bubbles, can move. Because buildings are always moving. We were talking about this last week. So, in terms of the brickwork, you also see this herringbone brickwork. Because if you just laid bricks like this, there would be a lot of tension, right? It would just crack. You know, it would just crack and fall over. So even just these small things, even though he didn't invent that, were really crucial. And so what I think that he probably did, and there's different ideas that I have, but I definitely think he used this principle, one for these ribs here, but also in terms of laying the bricks. You know, how do you actually lay the bricks in such a way that as this thing is being built, the whole is in the parts, right? This principle of the minimum that he discovered. And, you know, one thing that can be done is you can actually lay these bricks very similar, either as a spiral or you can lay them on this catenary track. You know, imagine if you had, like, say this catenary, and then like someone had a rope, and the rope followed the catenary, and you could actually make this spiral in such a way very similar to the igloo, but using this principle of the chain so that it could move and continue to move. And there's a lot more I could say on that, but I think that that is the most important thing. Oh, but I forgot the most important part of this whole class is what made this really difficult as a project is that Brunelleschi never wrote anything down. And the reason he didn't write anything down is because he didn't trust the oligarchy. And this is something that Tocola, I don't know if people know who Tocola is, he designed machinery. He worked very closely with Da Vinci. It's actually thought that most of Da Vinci's machines and Tocola's machines were actually Brunelleschi's machines. But he didn't write anything down. So just to give people a sense of the challenge I was up against, I want somebody to read this passage, and then we can open it up for questions, and I can explain more if people have questions. Who would like to read? Who's feeling like jumping on their feet? And
I can do that.
Yeah.
You volunteer.
okay.
Yeah.
Do the accent.
It's okay. You have to do an Italian accent.
See,
So you just have to read this paragraph here. It starts here and then goes to there.
grazie mille.
There you go.
Filippo Brunelleschi of the great and mighty city of Florence, a singularly honored man, famous in several arts, gifted by God especially in architecture, a most learned inventor of devices in mechanics, was kind enough to speak to me in Siena using the words, "Do not shake your inventions with many, share them only with few who understand and love the sciences. To disclose too much of one's inventions and achievements is one and the same thing as to give up the fruit of one's ingenuity." Sorry. Many are ready, when listening to the inventor, to belittle and deny his achievements, so that will no longer be heard in honorable places, but after some months or a year, they use the inventor's words in speech or writing or design. They boldly call themselves the inventors of the things they first condemned and attribute the glory of another to themselves. There is also the great big ingenious fellow who, having heard of some innovation or invention never known before, will find the inventor and his idea most surprising and ridiculous. He tells him, "Go away, do me the favor and say no such things anymore. You will be esteemed a beast. Therefore the gifts given to us by God must not be relinquished to those who speak ill of them and who are moved by envy or ignorance. We must do that which wise men esteem to be the wisdom of the strong and ingenious."
So, and even his contemporary wrote a book on architecture, Alberti, and didn't talk about how he did his stone. So, I'll leave it at that, and I mean, at some point more I could go through more in detail how I think he built the dome, but I just wanted to give people a taste of how you would think about building such a dome. And if people have questions, I think the most important thing is the kind of quality of identity that's demanded of all of us. We're not going to do something that's never been done before by doing it the way it's always been done. And yeah, so I don't know if people have questions.
What you are trying to highlight on Brunelleschi's architecture principles, what is matter with Lawrence's vision of economic prosperity?
Well, you want to know something ironic, except I told you last week, I think, but the very first that I know of in modern times that you actually had a credit system, you know, similar to Alexander Hamilton or the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it was in Florence. And even though a lot of it was run by, you know, you had the Medicis and the Pazzis and I think the Sforzas, and you had these different families in Italy, some of the families, like the Medici, they created a whole system of funded debt. So that entire city and principality entities would go into debt to fund projects. And including what happened with the dome, that, because money is mathematics, right? So there's no difference between saying a straight line is real and a dollar has value. There's no difference epistemologically in those two. And when you try to do something that's never been done before, what you find is that you can't use an economic system or metric, which gets back to this whole who's idea, right? If the measure and the thing measured are different and always changing, then how do you do that? So I would say that on one level, that's an aspect of it. On another level, if you want progress, what's the generation of progress? You know, that's a whole other thing. So that's what I would say for now to the answer of your question.
On the Pazzi Chapel that you showed last week,
Yeah.
there was a certain effect that you described, and I know people who've gone in and have said, you know, that you can hear anywhere. It has a certain, the acoustics are such that it's like everyone can be heard everywhere in the place. So it would create like a shock in the mind of people. I don't know if you can answer this, but in what way would this dome have that kind of same type of sharp effect on people? Was the fact that it was so big and that everyone said, how could you get that to look like that? And it would inspire them in that way? Did it have certain effects inside if you went inside? Or what would be, I don't know the equivalent, but how would you describe what effect it would have had on the population, like what you described about the Pazzi?
Well, I know I told the story last week, but when I was a communist doing my communist thing in Italy when I was like 17 or 15, and I kept wanting to come back to this church and I had no idea why, and I started having thoughts without words. I guess that's how I can best describe it, because that's the first time I actually thought about God, but I don't think I was self-conscious at that time that that's what I was thinking about. But I was just, I don't know, these things are funny to reflect on, but I was just overcome with like a totally different emotion and way of thinking about the world just being in this building. So I do think the building in and of itself has an effect, just like if you could be inside of a violin while it was being played, that would have an effect on you. And you know, in a certain sense, that's what a building is. And it's hard to think that a building can actually affect you because, like I brought up last week, like this building does not make me feel any better, aside from the fact that we're in it and it's our revolutionary headquarters. But there's nothing about like these walls that is making me think about like what is the substance of the human soul. And and these, you know, carpet patches with coffee stains on them. You know, they're not, like for instance, the floors of the Santa Maria del Fiore actually have different geometrical patterns in them. The dome has Toscanelli, who worked with Cusa to get Columbus across the Atlantic Ocean. He built the most accurate sundial the world had ever seen because it was way up on the top of this dome. And the sundial is actually in the floor of the dome. So there's a lot of aspects to it that made it great. I think it makes people see. It's funny because you get back to this idea of the dam they're building in Nicaragua right now, and you know there is this one aspect where the dome is very beautiful and it has an effect on your soul, and everything should be done that way. But then there's also just something great where you say, no more of this crap. We're going to do something. You know, we're going to do something we've never done before. And I mean, I can only imagine like being in Nicaragua and, you know, if you're 18 years old and you don't know what you want to do with your life and they're telling you can go to college and learn how to build this dam, you're not thinking like, Canal, yeah, sorry. How many, I wonder how many more ships are going to be able to, you know, now navigate from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but you're just overcome with this idea, we're going to build a canal bigger than the Panama Canal. And, you know, that's really the essence of being human, is people are much happier about what will be, not what is, if what will be is something that's never been. And that's the real, I mean, that's why kids are so great, because they haven't completely acquiesced to, you know, practicality. So I think there's a little bit of both. I think one is they wanted to do it to get out of the Dark Ages. And two, yeah, it's beautiful. And I'm sure Dante had a little bit to do with it, and some of these other people.
Well, did you find communism to be godly?
No. Yes and no. No and yes. What I found is that most people are good. Like when I went to Cuba, I found that most people are good no matter where you go, and they are godly no matter where they go. But you have these British systems that are imposed upon them, and the problem is the British system. Because the reason that I found LaRouche is because I was trapped in a real paradox, because after going to some of these countries, I realized that capitalism and communism were sort of the same thing, even though one might seem nicer than the other. And I was really intrigued with Mr. LaRouche because he said, you know, there's actually something that's higher. Just like with this dome, right? There are two architectural styles, and he didn't go with either of them. But there's always something higher. So I think to answer your question, there's always something higher. And that's what we're creating. And I think, you know, the fact that Vladimir Putin was in Cuba forgiving 90% of their debt, I mean, this is just so crucial, because despite all the isms and this, that, and the other thing, you know, Cuba and Russia have had a really profound relationship for several hundred years. So. Anything else?
Could you give us a sense of the dimensions of the dome, the height and the width and so on? And explain what is also meant by those marble ribs, which don't look as wide as they're mentioned in the text there.
so the text was something that Brunelleschi wrote before the dome was actually built, and I think somebody like recalculated a braccia, which is a measurement for Italy, Italian measurement during the Renaissance, and they actually calculated it wrong. But I think it's 140. I think it's 144 meters tall and 77 meters wide.
77 meters is 200 plus feet wide, right? 77, 80.
It's a long way across.
250 probably.
But see, the thing that struck me, I could be off with the numbers because I'm really bad about these things,
Okay.
but the thing that struck me, it's actually not as big as you think it would be. I was really shocked when oh wait, I think I have it right here. Let's see. Hey Jim, I tell you to Google it, but you don't have Google on your computer.
I have a different one.
I know, I'm just joking with you. Just kidding. I think this says right here, but I can't see it because it's wrong.
I think the figures are too high for this. Oh, there we go.
I think that might be the braccia is what I'm thinking, because they wanted it to be 144 units tall and 70-something units wide because it was some Gothic proportion that was holy in the Bible or something.
Ah, okay.
So all that science, is that something that, you know, the idea behind it is something that LaRouche-Pac wants the, you know, society and, you know, people just to discover for themselves and acknowledge, or it has some direct correlation with, I don't know, the political structures and that economical part? Because I you know, I believe there's, in my mind, what's important about those things is, you know, the spirals, the construction of it, the science behind it that can be, you know, developed and applied in modern science probably, and maybe medicine or something like that. But you know, this is that something like separate? It's just like a chunk of the information that, you know, one has to digest to realize that the concept of things are not exactly the way they are in, you know, in the mind of a, you know, contemporary person and human being.
Well, I'll tell you something. Most people today are probably way dumber than most people alive even then. Because they're not even craving these things. You know, at least at that time they were craving these things. They want this dome, this huge dome. You know.
So basically like a path towards, you mean to say the path towards creativity and...
Well, people have to understand the universe, and you know, I went through this a little bit last week, but you know, Mr. LaRouche made this point. With Cusa and Kepler, you had this maximum minimum principle, or Cusa and Brunelleschi, you had this maximum minimum principle discovered, and it was unified in the work that Kepler had done discovering the solar system. And then it was developed by Planck and Einstein, and he's, you know, really challenging us to look at Vernadsky and look at the principle of life, the principle of human creativity, you know, to really take these things to a higher level. But the point is that if people don't have a conception of the universe, if people don't have a conception of God, people don't have a real conception of nature and real physics and these types of things, impeaching Obama and getting Glass-Steagall passed is the last. I mean, it's not going to happen because people aren't driven to fight evil by acknowledging evil. They're driven to it by these higher ideas. people can be pretty damn practical.
When the church was completed and they started, giving services and stuff in there, I imagine they had services before the dome was completed.
They sure did, yeah, yeah.
But once they got it completed and once the chapel was completed, do you know if the acoustics in the church made a difference in how people would compose their hymns or songs? Or what I'm driving at is the construction of the cathedral, when it got completed, did it make a difference in how the music was?
I think it did actually. And there's these carvings in the cathedral of these by what's his name? De La Robbia, thanks. Of the actual singing, and Chuck wrote an article which you can read if you harass him, and he brought up the fact that there was actually music composed based off of certain intervals of construction of the church, which I think gets back to what you were saying, because the other thing is that Brunelleschi demonstrated is that there is no formula, but what there is there's beauty, and you can come to know something to be beautiful. And the thing about his dome is not only was it scientifically validated by the fact that it didn't fall over on itself, but it was artistically validated because it moved your soul, and that's not a coincidence. And I think that that's another thing that people, it's really easy for people to separate their culture from their political identity, and that's totally wrong. Because what you see with Brunelleschi is that he realized that beauty and science in statecraft were one. And by doing something that had never been done before, he was going to make the people around him better. And that's something that we have to remember, because, you can't talk to another human being about what to do for mankind, and then go listen to horrible music about, knocking up women and, enraged sounds and all of these other things, and expect that you're going to keep a type of quality of identity where you're going to stay in the fight. Because what I've found as an organizer in this movement for the last 10 years, not that you have to be totally formal about it, but most people who weren't passionately committed to classical culture never stuck around. And there's a reason for that.
Never what?
Never stuck around, didn't have the courage.
I think another point, I think you didn't really draw out directly, but is that economic progress is founded upon scientific discovery. Right? And that unless you have a science-driven economic policy, a scientific progress economic policy, then you'll have minimally a stagnant society. It'll go nowhere, but at least for a while, and then it'll decline, because you'll be exhausting the resource base that the level of technology and science is based upon. And this is what we lost when John Kennedy was assassinated, over the last 50 years now. That, in fact, you've got two generations that have never known scientific, technological progress and economic development as measured by the increased lifespan, increased education, increased health conditions of the whole population. Right? Up until about 1970, that was virtually the entire history of the United States. That every generation was better off than the one before. Right? But when we shut down the building of nuclear power plants and we shut down the idea of progress itself, right, then everything's stagnating. So 2 generations have never known what a healthy economy actually is.
And most of them don't know what beautiful buildings look like, or nice music, or, yeah. Not only do they not have a future, but they accept a present that's just, you know, it's obscene, and that's why we've really got to win.
Actually, one other thing. The dome is nearing 600 years old, right?
Oh, speaking of the damn communists, are you about to tell the story about the communists?
Which one?
About how the communists almost ruined the dome?
I don't know that.
Oh, let me tell that story, and then you can say your
Okay.
Didn't LaRouche intervene to stop them from screwing with the
Yeah,
dome?
the whole reason this came up is because there were holes in the dome. Not the ones I showed you guys in the drone, but in the dome there were holes. And there's a lot to be said about this dome. I mean, he did a lot of things to construct this dome, but the Communist Party of Italy was in charge of the Florentine City Council, and they thought that to give the dome more strength, they would fill, because it was 600 years old, they would fill these holes with cement. So they started doing that, and the dome became less structurally sound. It started cracking, and they had to take the cement out. And LaRouche was involved, maybe someone else can fill in the history a little better, but he was involved in a conference in the 1980s to save the dome from the commies. Which, as a red diaper baby, I can speak freely on the...
Are we talking about the Pantheon?
No, the actual Santa Maria del Fiore.
Oh, I see.
Brunelleschi stone.
In some of the masonry work, he left holes. I think I have some pictures I could show you, and they filled the holes with cement.
But he put the holes there on purpose
For a
to
reason.
allow for expansion and contraction, or was it a different purpose?
It's because it was a holy place. No, I mean, I think it's to allow the building to breathe.
Yeah,
Expand.
made it more flexible.
I mean,
Give it
just
strength.
like to release the tension or something in that way to breathe, or
Well, because the material's always moving. I mean, one thing is that the holes are actually lower down, because one thing you can also do is put holes to release some of the load, like the actual weight of the building.
Like the steel beams.
Yeah, right.
so if there were holes, that means like during the rain the water would go inside?
No, because they were, they're not actually through the hole. There's 2 shells. The dome actually has 2 shells, an inner shell and an outer shell. And it's usually the case that they're not all the way through. You just find patches of them. I can't remember if they were in the outer or the inner dome. I think they might have been in the outer. I actually don't remember. That I don't remember.
Right. The point I was going to make, it's almost 600 years old, and in about 1970, they built, the sports arena dome in Seattle, right? And in the about the year 2000, they had to tear it down because it started crumbling. Right? It became dangerous. So 20th century architecture doesn't match up to 15th century architecture.
It was also named the Kingdom.
Yeah.
I think there's enough technology and science. It's just the marriage of science and the culture is not really right.
Yeah.
We do have it. I mean, just imagine these days. Okay, look at something like that. If that dome was built in a village, or anybody who would want to utilize it, they would have to go there and they would imagine everyone else in there. In other words, it wasn't just the individual's, gift.
Yeah.
It was a gift to everybody. But today, with the technology, a kid takes a iPhone. There's a tremendous amount of science there, and he doesn't understand it really. he just looks at it as something that serves him, himself. Or I can call my girlfriend or whatever, anytime I want, and I can look for anything I want, that it's a channel to the person and his self. So it doesn't put people together to create a,
It's like what LaRouche used to say, like when you take the aqueducts, and he said, the father can go to the son at a certain point and says, I built this, and it's, serving humanity for 50, 100 years later. You attribute something beyond your mortality.
Do you know how long the dome is kind of projected to still last? I mean, is it going to be there for another 1,000 years, or?
How do we get rid of the dome?
If it gets hit by a nuclear missile, it will be gone.
Yes, we know that one.
Hopefully, and we can develop the technology to keep it as long as possible, and one day someone will, they'll do something even more beautiful.
Do you know if I think he's a architect professor or something. I think maybe he's in England or something. But he's built a 1/5 scale replica of the dome.
Yeah.
He's in Florence.
Yeah. I know about that guy. And I have a lot to say about that, which I probably shouldn't say now because it'll take a long time. But the idea that Lenore, Matt's aunt, had, although I guess to you guys, some of you guys, Matt's her nephew. But anyways, Lenore had this idea that they basically built this model of Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, and I have different ideas about it. But he's the one that has the theory that you could hang these series of ropes and then, sort of project them as you're laying the brick, which I'm not sure I totally agree with that theory, but I think it's better than a lot of them. But the cool thing is that at a certain point, he was having trouble finishing the project, so he brought in all these brick masons from the United States. Master. So she said I should contact them and ask them about what they thought. And I think that's a really good idea. So I'm going to do that because I forgot to do that and you just reminded me. And we can talk more about that video. But.
Can I make sure, I just wanted to say one thing. What you said before when people were asking would create, it's sparked some ideas in my mind. And sometimes, there's been, for example, yesterday I was talking to Eric, and it's interesting how different things come together and make sense of different chunks of information I get over here, and maybe that's something that I got before. When someone was asking about the dome and what benefit it does for to the human being as far as not only construction but the resonance of the sound over there. I don't know about the God and religion, what kind of religion and stuff, but it's all man built, and it's a piece of art, as far as the architecture, and with those, I guess churches, having those domes and singing over there would greatly, affect people. Now I think that, everything comes to to vibrations or like resonance, because for people, as how I don't know which kind of like law of universe it is that unless it's resonating somewhere, it's not really important, interesting, or something that should be noticed. And maybe that's the reason we put pictures on Instagram, and or for a person to try to what's the main idea, what's the way for a person to quickly become famous? Do something that resonates. Now there's like a physicist has their string theory. I don't know if it has to be like a spiral theory, but I think a lot of there's tons of research. What I know, there's tons of research that has been done on the on how different type of music or different acoustic sounds affects human physiology and the benefit of that. And if you look at the movie and there's like a sound of God speaking to a man, it sounds like it's really resonating, or it's like in a big room or theater or something. Now probably as far as the when we are talking about the creativity and Bach, for example, that it affects a human mind, that's probably, I would say, maybe something to be researched, but like something interesting to me. A catalytic that increases the effect of the positive, proper music to the mind of a person if it's played over there, and the proper, acoustics. Just in the same way, people kind of adjust the sound in different, concert halls to make it sound better.
You know what I think? You're obviously thinking a lot. I think this thing I handed out, it's actually a weekly report with Mr. LaRouche and this woman Megan Beats and a few others. You should watch it or read it. It's like an hour long. And then come back with those ideas, because I think that it'll really address a lot of what you're thinking right now.
Okay.
It's really good, and I can help you find it.
The thing is called Music, Not Mathematics, is the measure of the universe?
Yeah, if you Google that and type weekly report, it should come right up and you can watch it.
And that's a video or text?
It's a video, but it's also, they transcribed it and put it in our EIR magazine. So if you prefer to read, I can find you the article. If you prefer to watch it, I can
I'm
show you.
familiar with Google, but I'll address it to you if I can't find it.
Okay, yeah, but I think that'll really get at some of the things you're
Okay.
So Mr. LaRouche was first confronted with this idea. I don't know how many people heard the story about when he went to the Charlestown Naval Yard. Have people heard this story? When he was about 11 or 12 years old, and they were building a naval yard in Massachusetts where he grew up, and he was looking at the metal beams, and what did he notice about the steel beams? They had holes in them. And he brought this up to his geometry teacher in 6th, 7th grade, that this is geometry, and she basically told him that he was crazy. But he discovered, from a very young age, that there is a physical universe. There are principles that go against what you would expect, and that popular opinion of his time was actually against those truthful principles and looking to something easy. And even at 12 years old, one, he knew that would destroy society, and two, he sought out higher thinkers like Leibniz, and that led him on this whole other track. So that made me think about Filippo Brunelleschi, who I'm going to talk about, in this one little story, because he built this dome of the Santa Maria del Fiore, as you can see here. They started it in about 1420, and they finished about 1430, so it took about 10 years. They built it in 8 parts out of brick. There's a lot to go into on that we'll go into later. But he was a very, very respected person. How many people here have heard of Brunelleschi? How many people haven't? Okay. So I'll get into that a little bit tonight because he's someone that Lyndon LaRouche identifies with Nicholas of Cusa and Kepler of defining the basis for modern civilization, both in terms of science and also the fight against this oligarchical idea of man as an animal. So before I get to how he built the dome, can people see these windows here?
Yes.
When they hadn't decided yet how they were going to build this dome, the first thing they did is they built a drum to put the dome on. And they were going to build the thing without these windows here. And Brunelleschi, you think about LaRouche looking at the steel beams of the Charlestown Naval Yard with the holes in it. He said, oh, no, there has to be holes there. And everybody said, but at some point we want to get to a place where everybody is of that quality. You know, a certain culture, like for instance in Nicaragua, they're about to build, with the help of China, on the model of the American, you know, credit system of Hamilton, etc., they're about to build a canal through Nicaragua. And the thing that's so amazing about this is you think about what is the first thing they're doing? They're changing their whole educational system so that the young people of Nicaragua will actually know how to be engineers, heavy equipment operators, that essentially this project that you might be able to look at on a map and say, okay, there on the map, you know, they're going to dig a trench and ships are going to go through it. But this whole region of the world, the identity of young people is being changed and they're being prepared to do something, you know, completely new. But what we're dealing with as a block is that that's the identity that everybody wants. You know, when Brunelleschi built the dome, there were hundreds and thousands of people who wanted to lay the brick to build it and help him make new discoveries. But in terms of actually sticking your neck out on the line and creating that capability, that's leadership, and that's what the people in this room represent. Because Lyndon LaRouche made the point a few months ago, most people will not muster within themselves the type of self-criticism that's necessary to create the future that they want. I don't know if that makes sense to people. And that's what we have to do, and it's challenging. So that's the type of person that Brunelleschi is. He brought people along with him, and this is the type of person that LaRouche is. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that you have to have quite a mind and quite an imagination. You know, not memorize everything on Wikipedia or something, but actually understand certain things about the universe, and that the universe is always changing. And one of the things that Mr. LaRouche brings up that's really important about what Brunelleschi did is that he destroyed the concept of straight lines. That for a couple of thousand years in the Dark Ages, people were committed to a very Euclidean, point, straight line, square, Aristotelian idea of the universe. All you can know is your senses, etc. And that might seem like something small, but it's something very big. And for those of you who don't know, I'm Alexandra, and I'm doing the second part in an infinitely parted series. Actually, it's the second of two parts on Brunelleschi, and if you missed the first part, I'm hoping that this is a separately contained idea, but people can feel free to ask questions. But essentially, as people hopefully in this room have a sense of, we are very close to victory. And it's a real thing. It's not a guaranteed thing. People shouldn't think of it as that, but they should think of it as real, like as tangibly real as what we're experiencing now. And as a product of this real victorious, optimistic sense that Lyndon LaRouche has, he's put together a training program for some of the younger-ish members of our association, what he calls the basement team, to really develop in themselves and in the organization in general a higher sort of an upshift in terms of leadership capabilities. So I focused a little bit on the fight that broke out last week between mankind and the oligarchy, but I want to bring up something that's somewhat of a higher order, which is a real creative identity per se. And the most creative person I know, and probably everyone in this room knows, is Lyndon LaRouche. So even though this class is on Brunelleschi and how he built the biggest, but I don't necessarily mean grandest and biggest in terms of size, but dome ever built, which I think a lot of people are provoked and curious about. How did he do this amazing thing that had never been done before? So the way I wanted to initially approach this is to think about somebody who's like Lyndon LaRouche. And Lyndon LaRouche is not a practical person. I mean, anybody who would have done what he's been doing for the last 40 years is not a practical person. Because you just see things are getting worse and worse and worse, and you're like, oh, maybe it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. But he is committed to breaking the trends, and that's what makes him stand out and unique. Lumber, they weren't going to put ugly things, buttresses around it, etc. So this is a challenge that Brunelleschi grew up around. And before I get into that and how he solved it, the real issue of how he solved it, because Lyndon LaRouche said Brunelleschi discovered the principle of the minimum, Cousin discovered the principle of the maximum, and that was the basis for Kepler discovering universal gravitation. So before I get to the dome per se, what is the characteristic of the universe in which a dome or a church or a cathedral would be built? And because LaRouche is really, he's put forth a challenge in recent times of actually looking at life and cognitive life in the solar system and the solar system in the galaxy. And what types of interactions are you looking at? And so I was thinking about this. I found this wild thing. This is, now, it's not really, you can't really think about this in terms of straight lines and pathways because there's a harmony to the solar system. But I thought even this is kind of funny because here you have this idea of the way that the planets move. But can you see that? The planets are moving in a galaxy that's moving.
Yeah, that's how they really do.
Is that on YouTube?
Yeah. Here, I'll play it one more time for people.
Yeah, there's other animations of that. But that's a good one.
So if the universe takes this type of behavior in the large, why would it stop? Why wouldn't it be that way in the small as well, right? In a building or, in nature. So we can start off two things. One is this here by Mr. LaRouche, which will give you a sense of what we're looking at here in terms of a universal. real quick, here's one more thing. This is a painting they built in the 1360s before they, or painted before the dome was even built. And if you can see, it's not even as beautiful as what was done. Oh, well, you know, windows are nice, but we don't know how we're going to build this dome, and if we put windows in this drum, and then we put this big dome on top, it's probably going to break. And he said, well, you need the holes in this dome. It's not, you actually need the holes. And so they went along with it, and then as they were building this drum to put the dome on that they weren't sure about how they were going to build, the drum started cracking. And he said, oh no, the cracks are supposed to be there too. And he was very, very assertive on this, and we'll get into this, but this is an example of how people want a certain future, but they don't know how to create it. Because the thing is, you know, everything in the universe is always changing, and we'll get into that. You know, buildings breathe, they move. And he had an understanding of this that nobody else did. And I guess I can go really quickly into this, that in the 1300s, coming out of the Dark Ages, the city of Florence wanted to build a cathedral, a new cathedral for the city. And they didn't want it to be the architecture of France, which had invaded southern Italy, which are these very thick walls. They didn't want the Gothic architecture of, you know, the empires of the north. They wanted an architectural structure that was actually new. And they weren't sure how they were going to build it, but they really wanted it because for political reasons. And the church was the very first church that was not built or not funded by a king or a queen or the church, but it was actually funded by the city. And so they had, it was sort of like the Apollo mission. They had this, we're going to do something we've never done before, and we're going to get out of the Dark Ages. And the people that were responsible for this were people like the great-great-grandfather of Machiavelli, who many people probably know. Some of the grandparents of Brunelleschi, Alberti, a lot of the Renaissance thinkers that you know, their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents were involved in this great mission. And so they decided that as a part of it, they were going to build this dome, and they had certain proportions based on the Bible, but when you look at this, the proportions, this had never actually been done before. And the idea was it was going to be freestanding, it was going to be beautiful. They weren't going to hold it together with, like, you know,